Chapter 1: Sumer Civilization. Before memory, Sumer did not begin as a story. It began as a condition. Before epic, before dynasty, before the idea of history itself, there existed a low, unstable plain between two rivers whose behavior could not be trusted. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not bless, they threatened. They flooded without warning, shifted course, and left behind soil that was fertile only if humans learned how to restrain it. Civilization in Sumer emerged not from abundance, but from precarity. This distinction matters. Sumer was not founded by conquerors or visionaries seeking immortality. It was founded by communities attempting to survive uncertainty through coordination. Before temples reached toward heaven, levees held back water. Order preceded meaning. In this sense, Sumer represents civilization before memory, a society that organized itself before it could fully explain itself. The earliest Sumerian settlements, such as Eridu, Uruk, and Lagash, were not cities in the later monumental sense. They were nodes of cooperation, places where surplus grain could be stored, redistributed, and protected, where labor could be scheduled, where disputes could be mediated. What bound people together was not shared myth, but shared risk. Water was the first sovereign. Irrigation transformed the southern Mesopotamian plain into one of the most productive agricultural zones of the ancient world. But irrigation also required constant maintenance. Canals silted, dikes failed, fields salinized. The land punished neglect quickly and without appeal. To farm in Sumer was to participate in an unending negotiation with entropy. From this negotiation emerged institutions. Temples arose first, not as houses of abstract gods, but as administrative centers. They stored grain, recorded labor obligations, and coordinated festivals that doubled as accounting cycles. The priesthood did not initially rule through belief, but through logistics. Religion followed administration, not the reverse. This inversion is crucial to understanding Sumer's originality. Only later did kingship emerge as a stabilizing fiction layered atop existing systems. Early rulers presented themselves not as creators of order, but as its guarantors. They were stewards, judges, and protectors of canals rather than heroic conquerors. Power was justified by function. Yet even this functional authority required explanation. Why should some command while others labor? Why should surplus be surrendered? The answer was cosmological. The gods had established order, and humans were tasked with maintaining it. Kings mediated this divine mandate. Obedience became sacred. Here, memory began to crystallize. Cuneiform writing did not arise to record stories. It arose to track grain, labor, and debt. Clay tablets listed rations, inventories, and transactions long before they carried hymns or myths. Writing was an accounting technology before it became a narrative one. This priority shaped everything that followed. Because writing began as record rather than reflection, Sumerian civilization developed a profound awareness of obligation. Life was structured by what was owed to temple, to ruler, to God. Existence itself was conceived as debt. Humans labored because the gods demanded service. Suffering was not injustice, but condition. The famous pessimism of Sumerian literature, the sense that the world is unstable, the gods indifferent, and fate unavoidable, did not emerge from abstract philosophy. It emerged from lived experience in an environment where effort did not guarantee security. In Sumer, Prosperity was always temporary. This awareness informed Sumer's political fragmentation. Unlike later empires, Sumer never fully unified. It consisted of competing city-states, each with its own patron deity, administration, and irrigation network. Cooperation occurred, but so did conflict often over water access and land. Yet even warfare followed institutional logic. Victories were recorded as restoration of order, defeats as divine displeasure. History was moralized, but never idealized. No Sumerian text promises permanence. This lack of illusion is striking. While later civilizations obsessed over eternity monuments, afterlife, imperial destiny, Sumer accepted impermanence early. The Epic of Gilgamesh, often cited as humanity's first literature, does not celebrate immortality. It rejects it. Gilgamesh learns that even kings die, and that meaning lies not in escape, but in acceptance. Civilization, the epic suggests, is what humans build, knowing it will not last. This is why Sumer matters. It established the foundational grammar of organized life: cities, law codes, writing, bureaucracy, cosmology. But it did so without the confidence that later civilizations projected backward. It did not pretend that order was natural or guaranteed. Order was work, fragile, contested, and temporary. Even law reflected this realism. Early legal codes were not universal moral systems. They were attempts to standardize compensation, limit retaliation, and stabilize exchange. Justice aimed at balance, not perfection. Its institutions were inherited, translated, and adapted. Writing survived, law survived, urban life survived. What disappeared was political autonomy, not civilizational influence. This is the paradox of civilization before memory. It shapes the future without preserving itself as a unified past. Sumer built the tools through which later societies would remember, even as it itself became fragmented and absorbed. Its legacy is not a monument, but a method to live together under uncertainty, to accept limits, to build knowing collapse is possible. Before history learned how to glorify itself, Sumer learned how to function. In the next chapter, we will examine how writing born as accounting became power, memory, and control, transforming Sumerian administration into the template for all later states. Chapter 2: Sumer writing as power before meaning. Writing in Sumer did not emerge to preserve memory. It emerged to discipline reality. The earliest cuneiform tablets contain no myths, no prayers, no heroic lineages. They record sheep counts, grain rations, labor assignments, deliveries received and owed. Writing was born as an administrative prosthesis, a way to stabilize obligations in a world where trust could not scale. This origin matters more than any later literary achievement. It reveals that writing was not initially about expression, but about control. As Sumerian settlements expanded into true cities, oral memory proved insufficient. Irrigation schedules, labor rotations, and surplus redistribution demanded precision. Errors meant famine. Disputes meant violence. Clay tablets replaced recollection with inscription. What was written became binding not because it was sacred, but because it was fixed. Writing froze agreement in time. This fixation altered social structure immediately. Those who could write or who controlled those who could occupy a new position of power. The scribe emerged as a crucial intermediary between institution and population. Literacy was not widespread, it was specialized. Knowledge was concentrated. The result was a subtle but irreversible shift. Authority moved from persons to records. A temple official could claim obedience not because he was remembered as fair, but because the tablet said so. A worker could be punished not because witnesses recalled his failure, but because the record listed his obligation. Writing reduced ambiguity. It also reduced mercy. In Sumer, inscription preceded interpretation. This bureaucratic logic reshaped religion. Gods themselves became administrators of cosmic order. Divine favor was recorded in omens. Divine displeasure was logged through disaster. Rituals became procedural. Prayer resembled petition. Sacrifice resembled payment. The universe, like the city, was governed by accounts. Yet writing did not immediately produce narrative. For centuries, Sumerian culture remained textually silent about itself. There was no unified history, no origin story binding all cities. Each city honored its own patron deity. Each archive served local needs. This fragmentation was not accidental. Writing reinforced autonomy by standardizing internal administration without imposing external unity. The technology enabled cities to function efficiently, but not necessarily together. Only later did writing expand into law and proclamation. When kings began issuing decrees, writing transformed from record to command. It traveled from ruler to subject, not merely between administrators. This transition marked the birth of the state as we recognize it. Law codes, such as those attributed to Yornamu or later Hammurabi, were not moral treatises. They were instruments of legibility. They defined categories: free, dependent, enslaved, property types, compensations, penalties, so that society could be processed predictably. Justice became standardized inequality. Writing made this possible by abstracting persons into types. Individual circumstance mattered less than classification. Once inscribed, status hardened. Appeal gave way to precedent. This was power without empathy, but with efficiency. At the same time, writing generated a new relationship to time. Oral societies remember through repetition and variation. Written societies remember through accumulation. Archives grow. Past decisions constrain future ones. Innovation becomes riskier. Sumerian civilization began to experience historical weight, yet meaning lagged behind mechanism. Writing existed before a philosophy of writing. Scribes copied forms without reflecting on their implications. Civilization was accelerating faster than self-understanding. This lag produced tension. On one hand, writing enabled unprecedented coordination. Cities grew larger. Trade expanded. Diplomacy became possible. On the other, individuals increasingly experienced life as obligation recorded elsewhere beyond immediate negotiation. Fate felt written because it was. Only gradually did Sumerians attempt to interpret this condition. Myths emerged not to celebrate power, but to explain suffering. The gods were portrayed as capricious, distant, even unjust. Humans existed to labor. Meaning was fragile. The Epic of Gilgamesh reflects this worldview. Its central anxiety is not conquest, but mortality. Gilgamesh fails to secure immortality, not because he is weak, but because the system does not allow it. The tablet itself delivers the verdict. Writing here becomes tragic awareness. Yet even as Sumerian texts confronted limits, the machinery of inscription continued. Bureaucracy did not pause for philosophy. The state expanded its reach. Archives thickened. Civilization hardened. This duality, administrative confidence, paired with existential doubt, defines Sumer. It also explains why Sumer's influence outlived its political form. Later empires inherited its technologies of control, writing, law, accounting, state religion. They refined them, they expanded them, but they did not escape the foundational tension. To write is to fix is to control is to risk injustice. Sumer learned this first. When Sumerian city-states were absorbed by larger powers, their scripts, laws, and administrative habits persisted. The conquerors needed them. Writing was too useful to abandon, but meaning remained unstable. Writing could record debt, but not purpose. It could command obedience, but not belief. It could preserve law, but not guarantee legitimacy. This gap would haunt every civilization that followed. In Sumer, writing began as power before meaning. Only later would civilizations attempt to reverse the order to justify power through narrative, theology, and history. That effort would never fully succeed. In the next chapter, we will examine how law attempted to stabilize this imbalance, how justice was formalized to make power appear fair, and why this appearance was both necessary and insufficient. Chapter 3. Sumer Law as Balance in an Unbalanced World. Law in Sumer did not arise from ideals of justice. It arose from the need to limit damage. In a landscape where survival depended on cooperation, unregulated conflict was catastrophic. Feuds disrupted labor, retaliation spiraled. Vengeance endangered irrigation schedules and harvest cycles. The earliest Sumerian laws were therefore not designed to create fairness, but to contain disorder. Unlike later legal traditions that claimed divine perfection or universal morality, Sumerian law was openly pragmatic. The answer was encoded in compensation, fines, and standardized penalties. Justice was measured, not moralized. This is why early law codes focus obsessively on property, injury, and status. They translate violence into equivalence. Punishments were primarily financial rather than corporal. The goal was restoration of balance, not demonstration of power. Even death sentences were limited, reserved for acts that threatened the system itself. Law protected structure before it protected people. Crucially, Sumerian law assumed inequality. It did not attempt to erase hierarchy, it formalized it. Penalties differed depending on status-free citizen, dependent laborer, enslaved person. This was not hypocrisy, it was realism. Society already functioned hierarchically. Law made that hierarchy predictable. Predictability mattered more than fairness. In an oral system, justice depends on memory and reputation. In a written system, justice depends on precedent. People obeyed, not because the law was just, but because it was consistent. Consistency is a form of legitimacy. Yet this legitimacy was fragile. because law was tied to status. Any disruption to social classification threatened its authority. War, migration, debt accumulation, or enslavement could rapidly shift a person's position. The law then appeared arbitrary, even cruel. This tension is visible in Sumerian literature. Legal order coexisted with existential despair. Texts such as the Dialogue of Pessimism mock the idea that right action guarantees reward. Obedience does not ensure protection. Law restrains society, but it does not redeem it. Sumer never confused legality with goodness. Kings exploited this ambiguity carefully. Law functioned as political reset. By standardizing rules, rulers reasserted control without constant coercion. Law substituted for force where force was too costly. At the same time, kings avoided claiming authorship of law. Codes were presented as divinely inspired or anciently sanctioned. This removed responsibility from the ruler and anchored authority beyond human contestation. Law appeared eternal, even as it was continually revised. Here we see an early pattern that would echo through history. Power hiding behind permanence. Yet Sumerian law never achieved total control. Its reach was limited by enforcement capacity. Rural areas operated semi-autonomously. Temples enforced internal discipline differently from royal courts. Custom persisted alongside statute. This pluralism prevented absolute tyranny, but it also prevented uniform justice. Law was strongest where administration was densest near cities, canals, and storehouses. At the margins, negotiation and force still ruled. Sumer thus lived in legal tension, order without universality. This tension shaped social psychology. Individuals understood that law existed, but also that it could be navigated, avoided, or manipulated. Cleverness mattered. Connections mattered. Survival depended not on innocence, but on position. Such realism fostered neither idealism nor rebellion. It produced resignation. The gods, in this worldview, were not moral exemplars. They were powerful, unpredictable, and often indifferent. Divine law mirrored human law, binding, opaque, and unavoidable. Humans did not seek justice from gods. They sought mitigation. Appeasement replaced expectation. It constrained violence sufficiently to allow specialization, trade, and cultural production. It held society together long enough for civilization to take root. Law did not create harmony, it created endurance. When later empires inherited Sumerian legal traditions, they expanded and moralized them. Babylon would inscribe harsher penalties. Assyria would weaponize law openly. Each adaptation claimed improvement. Yet the foundational insight remained Sumerian. Law exists not to perfect humanity, but to make its flaws manageable. This insight is sobering and modern. In accepting imbalance rather than denying it, Sumer avoided utopian delusion. It built systems designed to function under imperfect conditions. Its law acknowledged inequality, instability, and human limitation. That honesty, more than any code, is Sumer's enduring contribution. In the next chapter, we will examine how economic debt formalized through writing and enforced through law became both the engine of Sumerian productivity and the quiet mechanism of social entrapment. Chapter 4. Sumer debt. As the architecture of dependence, debt in Sumer was not an accident of economy. It was a structural condition. Long before coinage, before abstract markets, before capitalism, Sumer built its social order on obligation measured forward in time. Grain owed after harvest, labor owed after flood repair, interest owed after scarcity. Debt was not marginal, it was central. It linked present survival to future submission. This was not moral failure, it was arithmetic. The Mesopotamian environment demanded constant investment. Canals had to be maintained before crops could grow. Seeds had to be stored before planting. Tools had to be produced before labor could begin. Temples and palaces provided these resources, but never freely. Advances were recorded. Repayment was expected. Writing made this system durable. A tablet could outlive a person. If a farmer died before repayment, the obligation passed to his household. If harvest failed, interest accumulated. Debt stretched across generations, converting misfortune into permanence. What began as assistance slowly hardened into dependence. This is how inequality stabilized itself. Sumerian debt contracts reveal a society aware of this danger. They specify repayment schedules, penalties, and collateral. Often the collateral was not land, still largely communal, but labor. A debtor might pledge himself, his children, or other household members into servitude until the obligation was met. Debt created persons who were legally free but functionally unfree. This condition blurred social categories. The line between citizen and dependent was porous, constantly crossed by drought, illness, or political disruption. Freedom was not a fixed status. It was a temporary achievement, vulnerable to reversal. Law did not prevent this. It regulated it. Legal texts limit the duration of debt servitude, specify treatment of dependents, and occasionally mandate release. These measures are often cited as humanitarian. In reality, they were stabilizing mechanisms. Excessive accumulation of dependents threatened social coherence. Too many indebted households meant labor, flight, rebellion, or collapse. Debt had to be managed, not eliminated. Temples played a central role in this economy. As the largest landholders and storehouses, they extended credit widely. In return, they acquired labor, loyalty, and influence. Religious obligation merged seamlessly with economic dependency. To owe the temple was to owe the gods. This fusion insulated power from critique. A debtor could not accuse the gods of exploitation. Misfortune was interpreted as divine will. Repayment became ritual as much as requirement. The system internalized submission. Yet the same system fueled productivity. Credit enabled specialization. Craftsmen could work year-round. Farmers could recover after poor harvests. Trade could expand beyond immediate surplus. Debt, when moderate, was generative. The problem was scale. As cities grew and competition intensified, debt concentrations increased. Successful institutions absorbed failed households. Land use consolidated. Labor dependency deepened. The economy became more efficient and more brittle. This brittleness surfaces repeatedly in historical records. Royal proclamations periodically canceled debts, freed dependents, and restored land. These acts were framed as justice or divine renewal. In fact, they were emergency resets. Without them, the system risked implosion. Debt forgiveness was not mercy, it was maintenance. Such proclamations reveal a profound awareness. Unchecked obligation destroys the very society that depends on it. Sumer understood this early. It experimented with limits. It failed to resolve the contradiction permanently. No civilization has debt, once institutionalized, resists moralization. It presents itself as neutral obligation, even when outcomes are devastating. Writing reinforces this neutrality. A tablet does not express compassion, it records balance. In Sumer, the future was always already owed. This temporal orientation shaped worldview. Life was experienced as a narrowing corridor of commitments. Freedom existed briefly between repayment and new obligation. Anxiety was structural, not psychological. The gods reflected this condition. They demanded service without guarantee. They punished unpredictably. They offered no covenant of justice. Human existence mirrored divine economy. Labor first, reward uncertain. This is why Sumerian literature often dwells on suffering without explanation. The righteous suffer, the wicked prosper. Debt logic does not align with morality. It aligns with arithmetic. Yet, despite this bleakness, Sumerian society endured for centuries. It did so because debt created interdependence. Everyone was bound to someone. Isolation was impossible. Survival required participation. Civilization advanced through entanglement. When later empires inherited Mesopotamia, they inherited this architecture. Babylonian law formalized debt more harshly. Assyrian power enforced it militarily. Each iteration expanded scale, not principle. The core insight remained unchanged. Obligation is the most efficient form of control. Modern economies still operate within this logic. Credit, periodic crises demand resets. The language has changed. The structure has not. Sumer was first to discover this pattern, not theoretically, but painfully. Debt, in Sumer, was not simply economic, it was ontological. To live was to owe. To owe was to belong. To belong was to survive. This is the hidden architecture beneath civilization's earliest cities. In the next chapter, we will examine how warfare emerged not as chaos, but as an extension of this system, how conflict between city-states was structured, ritualized. Chapter 5. Sumer War as regulated disorder. War in Sumer was not the breakdown of civilization. It was one of its administrative functions. This may seem counterintuitive, but the archaeological and textual record is consistent. Sumerian warfare was structured, ritualized, and limited in scope. It followed rules, seasons, and objectives. It was not annihilation. It was negotiation by other means. The reason is simple. Total destruction was irrational. City-states depended on the same river systems, trade routes, and labor pools. To devastate an enemy entirely was to destabilize the region on which one's own survival depended. War, therefore, aimed at rebalancing power, not erasing it. This logic shaped everything from army composition to battlefield behavior. Sumerian armies were primarily citizen militias, supplemented by dependents and retainers. Campaigns were seasonal, timed to avoid planting and harvest. Prolonged mobilization was economically suicidal. War had to be short, decisive, and limited. Victory was measured not in bodies, but in territory, tribute, or access to water. Control of canals and boundary fields mattered more than city walls. Many conflicts recorded in inscriptions revolve around disputes over irrigation channels, levees, and agricultural land. War was an extension of water management. Even royal inscriptions, often accused of exaggeration, reflect this pragmatism. Kings boast of victories, but rarely of extermination. They emphasize restoration of order, punishment of oathbreakers, and divine sanction for reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. War was framed as correction, not conquest. This framing required ritual. Before battle, divination was consulted. Omens were read. The gods' approval was sought not to guarantee victory, but to legitimize action. If defeat occurred, it could be interpreted as divine disfavor rather than strategic failure. Ritual absorbed blame. After victory, offerings were made. Captives were integrated as labor rather than slaughtered en masse. Temples benefited. The economy absorbed the outcome. War resolved into administration. This does not mean Sumerian warfare was mild. Violence was real. Death occurred. Cities were occasionally sacked, but these acts were exceptions, often remembered precisely because they violated the norm. Excessive violence signaled breakdown. The famous stele of the vultures, depicting the conflict between Lagash and Umma, illustrates this duality. It shows disciplined phalanxes and ritual aftermath, alongside images of fallen enemies consumed by birds. Order and chaos coexist. The message is clear. Violence is acceptable only within boundaries. Law and war were not opposites. They were complementary. When law failed to resolve disputes over land, water, or tributor, intervened as temporary enforcement. When war concluded, law reasserted itself to stabilize the result. The cycle preserved systemic continuity. This regulated disorder extended internally as well. Rebellion was rare, but not unknown. When it occurred, it was suppressed swiftly and framed as sacrilege rather than dissent. The goal was deterrence, not ideological conversion. Authority relied on predictability. Yet, as with debt and law, warfare carried inherent risk. Success created ambition. A city-state that won repeatedly accumulated resources, dependence, and prestige. It could begin to imagine dominance beyond equilibrium. This is where Sumer's system strained. The rise of figures such as Enatum of Lagash demonstrates the temptation of expansion. Victories encouraged centralization of power. Tribute flowed inward. Military organization professionalized, but the environment imposed limits. Extended campaigns disrupted agriculture. Occupation required administration. Resistance drained resources. The same logic that made war efficient at small scale made empire unsustainable. Sumer never fully escaped this constraint. Attempts at regional dominance emerged repeatedly and failed repeatedly. Akkad would later succeed temporarily by militarizing administration at unprecedented scale, but even Akkad collapsed under its own extension. Sumerian warfare thus reveals a fundamental truth. Violence can regulate systems, but it cannot replace them. Civilization can absorb limited conflict. It cannot survive endless escalation. The Sumerians understood this intuitively, even if they lacked the language to theorize it. This understanding shaped their worldview. The gods were powerful but quarrelsome. Order was fragile. Stability was temporary. Victory was conditional. There was no illusion of permanent peace. War existed as a necessary Evola release valve when negotiation failed. It was feared, ritualized, and contained. When it exceeded containment, civilization suffered. This pattern recurs throughout history. But in Sumer, it appears in its earliest, clearest form. War was not outside civilization. It was one of its tools. In the next chapter, we will turn inward to the individual's place within this system. How did Sumerian society shape the human self? What did it mean to live as a person defined by obligation, law, debt, and divine indifference? Chapter 6. Sumer, the self under obligation. The Sumerian individual did not stand at the center of the world. The system did. To live in Sumer was to exist inside a dense web of obligations, economic, legal, ritual, and cosmic. Identity was not defined by inner belief or personal aspiration, but by position. One was known by what one owed, whom one served, and which institution recorded one's name. This produced a conception of the self radically different from modern assumptions. There was no notion of autonomous individuality in the later philosophical sense. The Sumerian self was relational, constituted through duty rather than choice. Freedom was situational and temporary, emerging only in the spaces between obligations. From birth, a person entered accounts already in motion. Households were economic units before they were emotional ones. Children inherited not only land or tools, but debts, labor, expectations, and social rank. A son was future labor. A daughter was alliance or collateral. Affection existed, but it was secondary to function. This was not cruelty, it was necessity. The environment permitted little margin for inefficiency. Every person had to contribute. Survival required predictability. The self was shaped accordingly, practical, resigned, and aware of limits. Religion reinforced this orientation. The gods of Sumer were not moral guides or personal saviors. They were powerful administrators of fate. They granted prosperity or disaster without explanation. Humans did not commune with gods. They appeased them. Prayer was not confession, but negotiation. The result was a psychology of humility without hope of transcendence. Sumerian texts reveal little interest in inner transformation. There is no promise of salvation, enlightenment, or eternal reward. The afterlife is bleak and undifferentiated. Meaning is not deferred beyond death. It must be managed within life. This produced a culture focused on endurance rather than fulfillment. Wisdom literature emphasizes moderation, obedience, and caution. Excess is dangerous. Ambition invites ruin. Cleverness is survival, not rebellion. The ideal person navigates obligations skillfully rather than challenging them. Yet, within this constraint, self-awareness emerges. The laments, dialogues, and epics preserved on tablets show individuals questioning their fate, not to overturn it, but to understand their place within it. Suffering prompts inquiry, not revolt. The question is not, why is this unjust, but how must I respond? This distinction is crucial. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often misread as heroic individualism. In fact, it is a narrative of limitation. Gilgamesh begins as an unrestrained ruler, abusing power. His journey does not grant him transcendence. It teaches him restraint. He returns to Uruk, wiser, not freer. The self, in Sumerian thought, achieves dignity not by escaping obligation, but by accepting finitude. To know one's limits is to live well. To defy them is to invite destruction. This ethos permeated daily life. Craftsmen perfected skills over generations. Farmers followed rhythms older than memory. Scribes copied texts they did not author. Innovation existed, but it was incremental and cautious. Tradition was not worshipped, it was trusted. Trust in an unstable world is survival strategy. Even kings were not exempt. Despite monumental titles, Rulers presented themselves as servants of gods and restorers of order. Their legitimacy rested on fulfilling roles, not expressing individuality. Failure invited divine punishment and political collapse. Power did not liberate the self, it intensified obligation. This is why Sumerian civilization appears emotionally restrained. There is little celebration of joy, romance, or personal triumph. When happiness appears, it is fragile and fleeting. The tone is sober, often melancholic, yet this sobriety enabled endurance. By refusing illusions of control or destiny, Sumerian culture cultivated realism. People expected hardship, they prepared for loss. They did not assume fairness. When disaster struck, it was painful, but not incomprehensible. This psychological preparedness may explain Sumer's longevity despite repeated disruption. Civilization did not promise meaning, it promised structure. Within that structure, individuals found enough stability to live, work, and pass obligations forward. The self was not sovereign, it was situated. Modern readers often find this vision bleak, but it carries an insight largely lost. Societies can function without centering individual fulfillment. They can prioritize continuity over happiness, survival over expression. Whether such a model is desirable is another question, but historically it worked. In Sumer, the self was shaped by systems older and larger than any individual. People did not imagine themselves as authors of history. They were participants in irreplaceable, constrained, yet necessary. This conception would evolve over millennia. Later, civilizations would experiment with transcendence, salvation, and individual destiny. They would promise more and often fail spectacularly. Sumer promised less and delivered durability. In the next chapter, we will examine how time itself was understood in this world, how Sumerians perceived history, repetition, and inevitability, and why their sense of time resisted ideas of progress or ultimate purpose. Chapter 7: Sumer Time without progress. To the Sumerians, time did not move forward toward improvement. It circled, returned, and repeated. This distinction separates Sumerian civilization from almost every modern worldview. There was no belief in historical progress, no expectation that tomorrow would be better than today, no narrative of collective ascent. Time was not a ladder. It was a cycle of maintenance and decay, forced to be managed, not conquered. The past was not inferior to the present. It was authoritative. Ancient texts were copied verbatim for centuries, not because imagination was lacking, but because deviation was dangerous. What had worked before was trusted. Innovation without precedent risked cosmic imbalance. History, in Sumerian thought, did not teach lessons for improvement. It confirmed patterns. Floods came before. They would come again. Cities rose, cities fell, kings ruled, kings were forgotten. This repetition was not tragic, it was expected. Calendars reflected this worldview. Time was organized around agricultural cycles, ritual obligations, and celestial movements. Months were defined by tasks, not aspirations. The future was a schedule, not a promise. Even language reveals this orientation. Sumerian verb structures emphasize completion and continuity rather than future projection. The future tense is weak and uncertain. What matters is what has been done and what is being maintained, not what might be achieved. This shaped political behavior. Rulers did not claim to build a new era. They claimed to restore order. Every reign began with declarations of renewal, canals repaired, temples rebuilt, justice reinstated. But renewal did not imply novelty. It meant returning the world to its proper state. Collapse, when it occurred, was framed as abandonment by the gods, not systemic failure. When cities fell, survivors did not imagine a better system replacing the old one. They sought reinstatement of the same order under new patronage. Time erased individuals quickly. Sumerian kings' lists stretch back into myth, blending gods and men without sharp distinction. Names accumulate, but personalities dissolve. What endures is the office, not the person. Immortality, therefore, was architectural and textual, not personal. To build walls, temples, and canals was to inscribe oneself briefly into time. To commission inscriptions was to resist oblivion for a generation or two. Beyond that, memory faded. The Sumerians accepted this without resentment. The Epic of Gilgamesh confronts this truth directly. Gilgamesh's quest is not for moral enlightenment or societal transformation. It is for escape from time itself. He fails. His consolation is the city wall, human construction, enduring longer than flesh. Time wins. This acceptance produced a distinctive emotional discipline. Urgency existed, but not anxiety about destiny. People worked because work was required, not because it led to a better future. Suffering was endured, not dramatized as injustice, demanding correction. This is why rebellion was rare. Revolt assumes belief in alternative futures. Sumerian society assumed recurrence. Overthrowing a ruler did not promise change-only substitution. The structure remained. Resistance focused on survival, not transformation. Even catastrophe fit the cycle. Flood myths do not describe progress after destruction. They describe reset. Humanity continues, smaller, humbler, constrained. The lesson is not improvement, but containment. Containment of ambition, containment of hope, containment of chaos. Modern readers often misinterpret this as fatalism. It is more accurate to call it temporal realism. When environments are unstable and resources limited, belief in endless improvement is not optimism, it is delusion. Sumer chose endurance over illusion. This worldview allowed civilization to persist despite repeated trauma. When empires collapsed, scribes resumed copying. When languages shifted, accounting systems survived. When gods changed names, rituals remained. Time did not carry meaning forward. Meaning was reenacted. Only much later would civilizations imagine time as a narrative: creation, fall, redemption, progress. That idea would generate energy, expansion, and also unprecedented violence. Sumer stood before that turn. Its sense of time was sober, circular, and unstable. It did not flatter humanity with destiny. It did not threaten humanity with apocalypse. It simply reminded people that the world endures and humans pass through it briefly. In this sense, Sumer was not pessimistic. It was honest. In the next chapter, we will examine how this conception of time shaped law and justice, why Sumerian law focused on restitution rather than morality, balance rather than punishment, and how order was preserved without ideals of equality or rights. Chapter 8, SUMER, Law without equality. Sumerian law did not begin from the premise that all humans were equal. It began from a more basic assumption: order must be preserved. Justice, in this framework, was not moral aspiration, but administrative necessity. Law existed to stabilize relationships between classes, families, cities, and gods. rather than to express universal principles. The aim was equilibrium, not fairness. This is why the earliest law codes read less like ethical manifestos and more like repair manuals. The laws of Ur-Nammu, among the oldest known, are remarkably practical. Injuries, thefts, broken contraxi, defense corresponds to a specific compensation. Monetary fines dominate. Corporal punishment is rare. Execution is exceptional. Crime disrupts balance. Law restores it. But restoration was never symmetrical. Sumerian society was openly stratified. Free citizens, dependents, slaves. Legal consequences varied accordingly. The same act committed by different persons produced different outcomes. Equality before the law was not imagined, because inequality was not denied. Status was a legal fact, not an injustice. This clarity reduced ambiguity. People knew where they stood. Rights were not abstract entitlements, but situational permissions, defined by role, profession, gender, and temple affiliation. Law mapped reality rather than correcting it. Judges, therefore, were not moral arbiters. They were calculators of restitution. Their authority derived not from wisdom or charisma, but from precedent. Written records mattered. Contracts were inscribed, witnessed, archived. Disputes were resolved by reference to what had been agreed, not what felt right. This reliance on documentation compensated for the absence of a strong, future-oriented time sense. If the future could not be trusted, the past had to be recorded precisely. Writing served law before it served literature. Oaths, however, still mattered. Swearing by a god-bound individuals to cosmic order. False testimony was dangerous not because it deceived humans, but because it offended divine balance. Punishment could be deferred, invisible, and inevitable. Law thus operated on two levels: visible restitution and invisible consequence. Notably absent is the concept of intent. Modern law often asks what a person meant to do. Sumerian law asked what happened and what must be repaired. Accident and malice blurred. Damage mattered more than psychology. This is not cruelty, it is systemic thinking. When survival depends on irrigation, canals, grain stores, and seasonal coordination, individual feelings are secondary. A broken canal harms everyone, regardless of intention. Law responds accordingly. Family law followed the same logic. Marriage contracts specified obligations, dowries, and penalties. Love was irrelevant. Divorce was allowed, but costly. Adultery was punished not as betrayal, but as disruption of lineage and property. Women occupied a complex legal position. They could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, and serve as priestesses. Yet their status remained relational, defined through family and temple roles. Autonomy existed, but within tightly drawn boundaries. Slavery, too, was regulated rather than condemned. Slaves could marry, hold property, buy freedom. Abuse was restricted, yet slavery was normalized. Law mitigated excess, but did not challenge the institution. Stability required labor hierarchies. This pragmatic approach explains Sumerian legal longevity. Later Mesopotamian codes, Lipitishtar, Hammurabi, not invent new systems. They refined existing ones. The structure endured because it fit the environment. Unpredictable rivers, fragile cities, limited surplus. Law did not promise justice. It promised continuity. Modern readers often recoil at this. But moral discomfort should not obscure functional success. Sumerian law reduced violence, stabilized trade, and allowed strangers to cooperate under shared expectations. Equality would come later along with abstraction, ideology, and universalism. Sumer shows another possibility, a legal system grounded in maintenance rather than ideals. Its question was not what is right, it was what keeps the world from falling apart. In the next chapter, we will explore how this legal logic intersected with religion and fear, how gods functioned less as moral exemplars and more as regulatory forces in a universe without guarantees. Chapter 9, Sumer Gods Without Mercy. The Sumerian gods were not kind, they were necessary. Divinity in Sumer did not exist to console humanity or to guarantee justice. The gods were forces of regulation, personifications of powers that exceeded human control. Floods, droughts, fertility, disease, political fortune. To worship was not to love, but to negotiate survival. This is the first great theological rupture between Sumer and later moral religions. The gods did not explain why suffering existed. They were the reason suffering could not be eliminated. Sumerian mythology offers no covenant, no promise of protection, no redemptive arc. Creation itself is accidental, even careless. Humans are formed not as moral projects, but as labor solutions created to relieve the gods of agricultural and ritual work. This origin matters. If humanity exists to serve divine needs, then divine concern for human well-being is incidental. The gods demand offerings, maintenance of temples, correct ritual performance. In return, they may grant stability, but never certainty. Prayer, therefore, is strategic. Hymns praise power, not virtue. Supplication emphasizes humility, ignorance, and fear. The worshipper does not argue moral worth. They confess weakness and ask not for justice, but for restraint. Do not look upon me with anger. Let your heart be calmed. These are typical appeals. Divine anger is arbitrary. A person may suffer without wrongdoing. Illness, loss, misfortune, none imply guilt. The universe does not operate on moral reciprocity. This is why exorcists, diviners, and ritual specialists were essential. Their role was not to identify sin, but to diagnose which god had been offended, or whether chaos itself had intruded. Guilt was cosmic, not ethical. This worldview produced deep anxiety, but also a form of honesty, rare in later theologies. Sumer did not pretend the world was fair. It acknowledged that power precedes morality. Even kings were vulnerable. Rulers claimed divine favor, but never divine identity. When disasters struck, kings were blamed not for moral failure, but for ritual negligence. They might have failed to honor a god properly, rebuild a temple, observe an omen. Authority rested on correct performance, not righteousness. The afterlife offers no compensation. The Sumerian underworld is bleak, shadowed, and universal. Kings and peasants alike eat dust. There is no reward for virtue, no punishment for cruelty. Death equalizes by emptiness, not judgment. This absence intensifies the weight of the present. If there is no moral accounting beyond life, then order must be preserved here and now. Temples, laws, rituals, all compensate for the lack of cosmic justice. Civilization becomes a defense against indifference. Yet this system also limits fanaticism. Without moral absolutism, there is little justification for holy war or forced conversion. Gods are local. Worship is practical. One does not kill for theology, one adapts. Pluralism is natural. Cities honor their patron gods. but acknowledge others. Religious conflict is rare because divinity is not exclusive. Power can be shared. Omens can contradict. No single god controls everything. This makes Sumerian religion flexible, but emotionally austere. The Epic of Gilgamesh again exposes the cost. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does not appeal to justice. He appeals to endurance. He seeks immortality, not because he deserves it, but because death is unbearable. The universe offers no comfort, only walls, names, and fleeting memory. The gods do not intervene. They do not teach lessons. They do not redeem suffering. They simply persist. Modern readers often interpret this as pessimism. It is more accurate to call it disenchanted realism. Sumer faced a volatile world without inventing illusions of moral order. It built civilization anyway. In the next chapter, we will examine how this theology shaped knowledge and science, how astronomy, mathematics, and divination emerged not from curiosity, but from the need to anticipate divine volatility. Chapter 10. Sumer knowledge without certainty. Sumerian knowledge did not seek truth. It sought orientation. In a universe governed by volatile gods and cyclical time, certainty was neither expected nor attainable. Knowledge existed not to explain reality in abstract terms, but to navigate unpredictability. To know was to reduce surprise, not to eliminate ignorance. This is why the earliest sciences in Sumer astronomy, mathematics, medicine, divination developed as techniques of anticipation, not theories of causation. The stars were not studied for curiosity, they were watched for warning. Celestial observation formed the backbone of Sumerian intellectual life. The sky was a text written by the gods, constantly updating. Eclipses, planetary movements, unusual conjunctions each signaled potential disruption. Meaning was probabilistic, not deterministic. An omen did not declare what would happen. It indicated what might be at risk. This distinction is crucial. Sumerian divination did not paralyze action. It guided preparation. A bad omen did not end plans. It altered rituals, delayed campaigns, increased offerings. Knowledge shaped response, not belief. Mathematics followed the same logic. The famous sexagesimal system base 60 was not invented for elegance. It was practical. 60 divides easily. It simplifies fractions, measurements, and accounting. Timekeeping, land division, grain distribution all depended on calculability. Numbers were tools of administration before they were abstractions. Geometry measured fields and canals. Arithmetic tracked surplus and debt. There was no pursuit of proof in the modern sense. What mattered was repeatable functionality. If a method worked, it was preserved. If not, this pragmatism extended to medicine. Illness was not understood as a purely physical phenomenon. It was a disturbance, sometimes divine, sometimes environmental, sometimes social. Treatments combined herbal remedies with incantations. The goal was not diagnosis, but restoration of balance. A cure did not need explanation. It needed effect. Importantly, failure did not invalidate the system. When remedies failed, the conclusion was not that knowledge was wrong, but that forces were stronger. Knowledge had limits, and those limits were accepted. There was no crisis of epistemology. Writing reinforced this orientation. Scholarly tablets compiled lists, stars, plants, professions, gods, symptoms, omens. Classification mattered more than interpretation. To name and arrange was to exert partial control. Lists do not explain, they stabilize. Sumerian scribes did not speculate about first principles. They curated continuity. Education trained memory, precision, and replication. Creativity was secondary. Fidelity was paramount. This does not mean innovation was absent. Techniques improved incrementally, calculations refined, observations accumulated. But progress was not conceptualized as advancement toward truth. It was accretion of usable patterns. Knowledge moved sideways, not forward. Divination illustrates this most clearly. Thousands of omen tablets record correlations. If X appears, Y may follow. No causal mechanism is proposed. Correlation suffices. Over time, patterns become trusted. Probability becomes expectation. This resembles early statistics more than superstition. Modern science often dismisses divination as irrational. Yet its structured data collection, pattern recognition, prediction under uncertainty is recognizably empirical. What differs is not method, but metaphysics. Sumer did not assume a lawful universe. Without that assumption, prediction becomes tentative by necessity. Knowledge must coexist with humility. This humility shaped intellectual culture. Scholars did not claim mastery. They served temples and palaces as technicians. Authority rested on accuracy, not originality. Errors were tolerated as inevitable. Revision occurred quietly. There were no revolutions of thought, only gradual recalibrations. Contrast this with later civilizations that equated knowledge with truth, certainty, and control. That shift would produce extraordinary power and profound hubris. Sumer stands before that transformation. Its epistemology accepts that the world exceeds comprehension. Knowledge is a scaffold, not a foundation. It helps humans stand a little longer against chaos, but it does not pretend to replace the gods. This stance produced resilience. When predictions failed, the system absorbed the failure. When disasters occurred, knowledge was not discredited. It was intensified. More observation, more ritual, more calculation. Uncertainty was not an enemy. It was the condition of existence. In this way, Sumerian knowledge mirrors its theology and law. All are instruments of containment, not conquest. They aim to hold reality in place just long enough for life to continue. In the next chapter, we will examine how these intellectual habits shaped empire and collapse. Sumer built cities, but not lasting empires, and how its civilization endured precisely by not seeking permanence. Chapter 11. Sumer power without permanence. Sumerian civilization mastered organization, but never trusted permanence. This tension defined its political form. Cities were powerful, empires were not. From the earliest period, Sumer developed dense urban centers Uruk, your Lagash Nippurich, with its own patron god, administrative apparatus, and economic network. These cities could mobilize labor, manage surplus, wage war, and produce culture at extraordinary scale. Yet they resisted unification. Political power remained fragmented. The Sumerians did not imagine history as a trajectory toward consolidation. Power was local, conditional, and reversible. Kings ruled by stewardship, not destiny. The title, Lugolophon, translated as king, did not imply sovereignty in the modern sense. A Lugal was a manager of divine property. Land belonged to the gods. Cities belonged to patron deities. Humans administered on their behalf. This metaphysical structure limited ambition. To conquer another city was not simply to defeat its army. It was to challenge its god. victory required not only military success, but divine realignment, omens, rituals, legitimizing narratives. Conquest was fragile. As a result, hegemonies were temporary. Strong rulers Enadam of Lagash, Lugalzagasi of expanded influence, imposed tribute, claimed titles of universal rule. But these claims dissolved quickly. Authority could not outlast the personal capacity of the ruler to perform rituals, maintain order, and placate gods. Succession was the breaking point. Without dynastic absolutism or sacred kingship, continuity was difficult. Each reign required renewal of legitimacy. Failure to deliver stability invited divine suspicion and political challenge. Empire required belief in permanence. Sumer did not possess it. Administrative sophistication paradoxically reinforced this limit. Because cities were highly self-sufficient, economically, ritually, administratively, they did not need centralized empire to function. Local order mattered more than imperial scale. Intercity networks existed, but autonomy remained the default. When empires did emerge, they came from outside. The Akkadians inherited Sumerian systems, but added a new ideology: personal kingship, universal rule, linear history. Sargon's empire was not just larger, it was conceptually different. It imagined time moving toward domination. Sumerian cities adapted rather than resisted. This adaptability ensured survival. Instead of clinging to political control, Sumerian culture embedded itself in institutions that outlived states: writing, law, ritual, education. When power shifted, these systems remained indispensable. Conquerors ruled through Sumerian scribes. They worshipped in Sumerian temples. They adopted Sumerian accounting. The civilization relinquished sovereignty, but retained relevance. This is power without permanence. Collapse, therefore, was not an endpoint. When cities fell to invasion, drought, or economic strain, population dispersed, ruralization followed, but administrative memory endured. Texts were copied, schools continued, gods were renamed, not erased. Sumerian identity transformed into Mesopotamian infrastructure. This pattern explains the civilization's extraordinary longevity. Though political Sumer vanished, its logic governed the region for millennia. Babylonian, Assyrian, even Persian systems rested on Sumerian foundations. By refusing to equate survival with dominance, Sumer avoided extinction. This is a counterintuitive lesson. Modern civilizations often equate greatness with expansion, unity, and permanence. Sumer demonstrates another model: depth over breadth, adaptability over endurance, transmission over control. Its cities were not eternal. Its civilization was in the final chapter. We will step back and assess Sumer's legacy not as an origin myth of progress, but as an alternative civilizational logic whose relevance may be greater today than ever before. Chapter 12: Sumer, the First Civilization, or the First Warning. Sumer is often called the First Civilization. This label flatters modern sensibilities, but it misunderstands what Sumer actually represents. To call Sumer the beginning of progress is to project a later narrative backward. Sumer did not imagine itself as an origin point, nor did it assume that history was moving toward improvement. It did not see itself as primitive, nor as foundational. It simply existed, organizing survival in a difficult landscape with sober intelligence. In this sense, Sumer is less a beginning than a diagnosis. It reveals what civilization looks like when stripped of illusion. Sumer shows that writing does not guarantee wisdom, that law does not require equality, that knowledge does not promise certainty, that religion need not offer comfort, and that power can function without permanence. These are not failures. They are design choices, adaptations to ecological fragility and cosmic unpredictability. The Sumerians did not seek mastery over nature. They sought coexistence with instability. This orientation matters today. Modern civilization is built on assumptions. Sumer explicitly rejected linear progress, moralized history, technological salvation, indefinite growth. These assumptions generate extraordinary capability. When certainty fails, belief collapses. Sumer anticipated this vulnerability. Its institutions were built to absorb failure, not to deny it. When floods destroyed cities, records were recopied. When gods disappointed, rituals intensified. When kings fell, scribes continued. Civilization persisted because it did not hinge on success. This resilience came at a cost. Sumer sacrificed aspiration. It limited hope. It constrained imagination. Its world was emotionally austere, hierarchically rigid, and often cruel. There was little room for liberation or transformation, but it endured. The question Sumer poses is not whether progress is possible. It is whether progress is necessary for civilization to survive. The Epic of Gilgamesh offers the final answer. Gilgamesh fails to escape death. He returns to Uruk and shows the city wall. The wall is not redemption, it is acceptance. Human achievement is temporary, but meaning resides in maintenance, not transcendence. This is Sumer's ethic. Civilization is not a ladder to the heavens. It is a scaffold against collapse. From this perspective, Sumer is not a triumph to celebrate, nor a tragedy to mourn. It is a warning written in clay. Societies that demand certainty from the universe will break when it refuses to comply. Societies that accept limits may last longer, but never comfortably. Sumer chose longevity over glory. Its legacy is not innovation, but orientation, a reminder that civilization begins not with optimism, but with restraint, not with dreams of domination, but with the discipline to endure. In an age once again defined by uncertainty, ecological stress, and fading assurances, Sumer speaks with unexpected clarity, not as our ancestor, but as our mirror. Conclusion: Sumer leaves humanity no promise. It leaves a warning that civilization does not arise from faith in progress, but from the capacity to endure uncertainty. That order does not require moral perfection to survivally continual maintenance, and that societies can function, even persist, without believing the world is just, meaningful, or ultimately benevolent. In the clay tablets of Sumer, there is no salvation, but there is lucidity. No dream of transcendence, but a discipline of survival. Sumer understood what many later civilizations learned only through collapse. Not every system must promise a future in order to justify its existence. Some exist simply to hold chaos at bay, briefly and imperfectly. Sumer does not end as a dead past. It ends as an unresolved question. When certainty dissolves, when progress falters, when the universe refuses reassurance, will we invent new illusions or relearn the oldest civilizational art, the art of enduring within limits?